So Jose Juan Lara Jr., MS, is a project manager at the National Latina Network, a project of Casa de Esperanza. In this position, he is responsible for managing, coordinating, and delivering training and technical assistance in the areas of enhancing cultural responsiveness in the courts and capacity to enhance services and increase leaderships to Latina and/or culturally specific organizations. Jose Juan began advocating for survivors of family violence in his hometown of Brownsville, Texas, in 1999, and has expertise in the areas of cultural competence and responsiveness, dynamics of gender-based violence, LGBTQ, language access, organizational development, and victims advocacy. Jose Juan has presented on these issues at the community level and nationally, engaging a broad spectrum of multidisciplinary professionals from the areas of criminal justice, social services, policy, and health. So without further ado, take it away, Jose Juan.
Good morning, good morning, good morning. Buenos dias, everybody. Hopefully everyone's doing well. It's Friday, yay, we survived the week. One more week, one more day, one more hour, one more minute. And before I go further, I just on the chat a shout out from Brownsville. So Brownsville's in the house. And actually, if I am interpreting or translating the initials FOW, Friendship of Women, actually that's where my origin story started in advocacy. I started as a legal advocate coordinator there 20 some years ago, now 20 years ago. So shout out to the folks at Friendship of Women. Yeah, so it's been a journey, y'all. So welcome, welcome, welcome. And gonna share my screen. And hopefully everyone can see my screen. There we go. So, but before we get started, and then Karen and Alexis, if you can just keep track of the chat. So I do welcome people to ask questions in the interim. So if there's any questions that come up in the chat, please feel free to engage in the, or interrupt or what have you. But before we get started, I just would like to get to know who's in the space with me. I know there's a lot of advocates in the space, but if y'all can type in the chat box, you know, which area of the state or even country you're tuning in from, your role in the organization, and then just a fun question. When was the last time you took a vacation? And when I mean a vacation, I mean you disconnected from work, you weren't called because something got stuck or some crisis happened, and more than just 2 days, I'm talking maybe a week or two. So if people can just share that in the space. I see Estela de Anda in the space. Hi, Miss Estela, one of my initial mentors into this work. So shout out to Estela. I'm glad to see you're still kicking it over there. But yeah, so again, the question is just introduce yourselves in the chat, your preferred name, pronoun, and then your role in the organization. And then when was the last time you took a real vacation? Because I think that's so important. Self-care is a radical thing in this line of work or in this movement. And sometimes we forget to do that for ourselves. We are so great about giving advice about resiliency to participants, clients, survivors, but we don't take the same advice for ourselves. So if folks can just type in the chat box, it would be wonderful. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute because I'm curious about the chats. So I see Miss Cecilia's in the house as well. Hi, Miss Cecilia. Let's see. We have people from Bastrop, people from Galveston, McAllen, of course. You know, the Valley's always got to be representing y'all. You have no idea. So proud of that. Let's see. Yeah, cool, awesome. And then someone said last November was the last time they took a week off or for vacation at the ocean. That would be so nice right now, for real, for real. So yeah, so welcome everybody. And just again, it's been a while since I've actually presented at a Casa conference. And so glad to be in this space as well with you all. So, and just continue to introduce yourselves and so on. So again, going back to the screen share, apologies for that. So this particular session for today, and hopefully you're in the right one, is culture and communication, a foundation for providing culturally and linguistically responsive services. So that is the class for today. And so, yeah. So for those who are not familiar with Casa Esperanza, we are actually located in St. Paul, Minnesota. And it was founded by a group of Latina activists back in the early 80s in response to a lack of culturally responsive services, specifically for Latinx survivors in St. Paul, in the Twin Cities of Minnesota. And some of the core tenets in the work that we do, and this is similar throughout the work that we all do, is mobilizing Latinas, Latinx, Latine, communities to end gender-based violence, because we know that it's in the hands of community to end these forms of gender-based violence. And then also emphasizing the development of social capital, meaning trust, reciprocity, exchange of information, cooperation, because again, we believe in that sense of community engagement to end these forms of gender-based violence. And so part of that, we have the National Latina Network, which is our national program. And so our emphasis around that work, which I'm part of that national team or the network, is we focus around public policy, research, training, and technical assistance. And so we are identified as one of the culturally specific resource centers on domestic violence and sexual assault within Latino or Latinx communities, under HHS or FIPSA, Family Violence Services Prevention Program or funding, and also under the Office of Violence Against Women, OVW. And as a National Resource Center, we get to do these type of workshops and also engage with individual communities around the issues of community engagement, culture responsive approaches, and so on and so forth, right? Of course, from our frame, which is Latino Advocacy Framework, right? And we do this in tandem with other national culturally specific resource centers. To mention a few is UJIMA, which they focus on within the Black, African American, African diaspora communities, Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, and they work specifically within, of course, API communities. And then there's also Women of Color Network, and they work specifically at the cross sections of people who identify as women and women of color in particular. And then also we have Mending the Sacred Hoop and Red Wing Consultants, and they focus on working with Native American, Indigenous, and tribal communities here in the US. And as a National Resource Center, our services are at your accessibility, right? So if you have any questions like around on language access or language justice or on this particular issue that we'll be talking about here today, please feel free to reach out. My contact information will be at the end of the PowerPoints, which I believe will be shared with all of you all. So, and then a little bit more about myself, because I'm the presenter and I have that privilege. As I mentioned before, I've been doing this for almost 20 years. I am from the Valley, specifically Brownsville, Texas. My family still lives there, very proud. And as I mentioned, I started off my origin story in Friendship of Women in Brownsville. And then through that, I got to meet, of course, the great and wonderful Miss Estela de Anda, and other wonderful people that allowed me to be part of this work as a male identified person, right? And then being humbled by that and understanding my own levels of privilege in this work and kind of deprogramming and unlearning and learning new stuff in this work around ending gender-based violence. And through that journey, I've been very blessed to work at both community-based level, statewide. So I currently live in Austin, Texas. So a little bit point of clarification, because some of you may be saying, you work for an organization that's in St. Paul, but you here in Texas. So I am also very fortunate to be to be a remote staff worker under the National Latina Network. And there's several of us here in Texas, actually. And then we're scattered all over the country, but our main home base is in St. Paul, Minnesota. And so, and I currently live in Austin, Texas, and I moved here 12 years ago to work at the Texas Advocacy Project, who some of you may be familiar with, and some of you, maybe some folks from TAP may be here or have presented at TASA's conference. Amazing organization. Always, when I have a chance to talk about the Advocacy Project, always encourage advocates to reach out to them. And then 6 years ago now, I transitioned over to Casa Esperanza National Latina Network. And so I now at this national level, I get to engage multiple forms of communities, culture specific organizations, and then also organizations that are by and for Latino or Latinx communities, and just engaging in these very complex and intricate conversations. So again, thank you, Tasa, for inviting me to be here and be part of your annual conference. And so in having this conversation, some of the learning objectives for today, hopefully, is, enhance our knowledge around the intersections of language as being part of our cultural identity and what does that mean. Engaging in critical analysis of unintended assumptions that we may have around survivors who are limited English proficient or speak with an accent. And then also, what can we do to foster more culturally and linguistically accessible services as part of our organizations, right? And that's an ongoing process. And it's also a collaborative process, because as amazing as we all are in our respective organizations, we can only be successful in providing care and changing the parameters around what community thinks around gender-based violence issues, and in this case, sexual assault or sexual violence, is really connecting with each other and really understanding what are these intersections of cultural identity, fill in the blank, right? As it intersects with gender-based violence. And so just like any conversation, whether it's in person or virtual, there's always things that come up for a lot of us, as Alexis mentioned earlier and Karen mentioned earlier. If at any point you feel like you're reacting to this conversation, we have to ground ourselves in this space, right? And so we always like to mention some guiding principles, is that being mindful of our own thoughts, reactions, and body language in this conversation. Also reflecting on our own privileges, right? Creating and maintaining a courageous space. And I need to change that, because I learned that there are no safe spaces for certain communities. And it's really about building courageous spaces, and what does that look like? Being self-aware in this conversation, share the space, even though we're virtual, let's share the space. Honoring, acknowledging, and affirming difference, diversity, and so on. And try to be present as much as we can. I know that some of you may still be working from home, and of course you may have partners, children, pets, and so on. Life still happens and life still goes on, regardless of pandemic or not. But really try ourselves to be present as much as we can. And then also really emphasizing that if you're feeling yourself reactive to the conversation, like, why is that? And it's based on the privilege that's being dismantled before us, and maybe that's a privilege that I carry, right? So just being mindful of that. And then, as always, this is a conversation at Casa Esperanza. We do not presume to have all the answers, because we don't. We are learners in this process of ending gender-based violence in the context of sexual assault or sexual violence. So this is a dialogue and an exchange of information, knowledge, and hopefully wisdom, right? Because we got to learn some stuff. We got to also hopefully have some wisdom. And then also acknowledge the fact that we each have our own perspectives of life, or our own worldviews, and so on. And so, we acknowledge that, and just like and this is my firm theory and belief, we all carry forms of internalized oppression And also, we also often externalize those behaviors as well. We all have different levels of privilege and not at the same time. And then we also carry assumptions of each other, right? Depending on where we come from and so on. And so again, this is a dialogue. So I would welcome people to put questions in the chat box. There will be moments of engagement throughout the conversation here today. So yeah, and then again, just emphasizing that our philosophy at Casa Esperanza is from a strength-based community engagement perspective, and so on. All right, so let's get to this conversation. So multilingual communities, right? And talking about one of the areas of technical assistance and training that we provide at Casa Esperanza, and a lot of it is around language access and language justice. And in our own work and our own evolution to this conversation, we were just jumping into the process of helping organizations develop a language access plan. And then realizing that, wait a minute, language is part of cultural identity. And there's also a lot of isms connected to that, right? The whole, to contextualize it, the whole English only perspective, which some of us carry that in many different ways, right? And it's definitely present in our communities, and it's definitely present in this country. And so part of this conversation, when we talk about language, it is an essential part of our cultural identities. It says, and also acknowledging that there are multilingual communities. We are becoming a country that is becoming global, of global majority people, of global majority countries and cultures and identities, which also includes languages. And so we start off this conversation with acknowledging that we are multilingual communities, and also not just talking about spoken languages or the ability to communicate in a different language, but also communities who use different modes of communication. For example, American Sign Language, right? And even further beyond that, or added to that, is even in the English language, there's different accents, right? And there's different understandings and usage of different terminology in the English language alone, right? So wanted to affirm that a little bit, because even in the English language, we all have different accents. And for some of us who grew up in the South, deeper South or what have you, if you speak with a Southern accent, there's automatic assumptions of your intelligence level and your family relations, right? So let's be honest about that. So again, we live in multilingual communities, and also people who use diverse modes of communication. And so I'm going to start out with some questions with y'all. Very a quick pop quiz is like, how many languages do you think are spoken in the US? If people could just put it in the chat box, that would be great. So how many languages do you think are spoken in the US right now?
We have Madison that says 225. Yvonne close says 250. Rick says over 200. Kayla 300. Okay, so we have Alyssa saying about 1,000. We got a 400 in here by Razy. Some folks are saying I don't know or have no idea.
That's perfect. Awesome. Thank you, Karen. So rough estimates, and it depends on what source that you get your information, but there's around 381 officially identified languages spoken in the US, right? Certainly there are a lot more. And also what's interesting, when I started to educate more around the sociological aspect around multilingual communities as it's connected to around language access and language justice, is that at the same time, there's an astronomical amount of indigenous languages that are being lost, that are becoming extinct at the same time. It varies from the source that you get, but I've heard like between 200 to 300 or 400 ancestral languages are dying every day, right? Something like that, right? And so one has to wonder, why is that? What is the ism connected to that, right? And we can go as far back as colonization and so on, and we don't have time for that. But think about those things as we have this conversation together. Like why are certain ancestral languages are becoming extinct, right? And how is it affirmed by the English only language perspective, specifically in the US? So just to give more context to this conversation, the top 5 languages spoken in the US, not including English, is Spanish, Chinese. This includes Cantonese, Mandarin, and other Chinese languages, Creole, Tagalog, Vietnamese, and so on. And then most of the individuals who speak another language also speak English with native fluency or very well. However, about 41%, about 25 million people are considered limited English proficient, though most LEP individuals are immigrants. Nearly 19% or 4 million were born in the US, most to immigrant parents. Overall, the LEP population represents 8% of the total US population ages 5 and older. But what we also know is statistics only report what's being reported, right? What we also know is that even in the creation of survey questions, they're very mainstream, right? And sometimes when we develop evaluation tools or survey questions are very specific and are often created from the perspective of the people or the identity that's mainstream and in power, culturally speaking, right? Both politically, socially, economically, and so on. So we know there's a lot more languages that are being spoken out there. And we also know that when people are being censused or accounted around different languages, some of them will not come forward because of being afraid of being identified and so on. So again, when we think about statistics, and I know this, we all know this, but I have to reaffirm this all the time. When we think about statistics, it's only what's being reported, and it also depends on how the questions are asked and in what communities those questions are being asked of, right? And is it being asked in a safe way, in a culture responsive way, and so on. And so just to put it in more perspective, because I was also curious in my own learning, like what is the #1 language that's spoken in the world that has taken over? And as you can see globally, English is the highest spoken language or other languages spoken in the world, right? Second to that is Mandarin, Hindi, Spanish, French, Arabic, Bengali, Russian, Portuguese, Indonesian, right? And of course, these stats will vary depending on the source, but globally speaking, the English language has colonized the world and it is there, right? And so again, when we talk about the intersections of language being part of our cultural identity, we have to think about how the English language has proliferated or colonized the globe, the world, right? And so just bringing it closer to back home here in our great country of Texas, you know, just to put it in perspective, like what are those top languages other than English that are spoken here in the Lone Star State? And so, of course, not surprisingly, we see at the top of the list, we have Spanish. And of course, and I don't know how it looks in your screen, but the lighter shade of purple or pink is Texas, and then the thinner, darker shade of purple is the US, just to give some reference to that. So again, Spanish, and then just to the US, it's about the same or as much spoken. We have Vietnamese, Chinese, Tagalog, Urdu, Hindi, French, Arabic, and so on. And so I would encourage you all in your respective communities, when you have the time, to just Google what are the top 3 languages spoken in your communities, right? And again, there may be in some communities, which it does happen, where people may not may not see, well, there's the majority of our community are predominantly English speaking and predominantly are racialized as white or so on. And so, but again, I would challenge that because I've been, being with Casa Esperanza National Latino Network, I've had the privilege to travel to all 4 corners of this country. And I've been to the Pacific Coast and so on. And I've done trainings where crisis centers say, well, there's no Spanish speakers here or whatever. And we do a training and all of a sudden I have a lot of Latino identified social service providers popping up and coming to the training, right? And I'm like, you know, they say if you built it, they will come, but you also have to promote it. You also have to create awareness around it, right? And so that kind of gives me a sense of like, how are you engaging community and moving beyond your comfort zone when you talk about, in this case, creating more language accessible systems, specifically in your own organizations, from a culture responsive framework. And so in talking about this, we also have to talk about the research on language and cultural access for survivors who are limited English proficient. And there have been some data collected on that. Few, but there has been. More specifically, when it comes to back in 2014, and you can see the citation there, there was a national survey done just on like who was around the issues around the expense of medical forensic exams, right? And so, but the interesting thing that also came up with is also around limited English proficient survivors and the challenges they had accessing medical forensic exams and so on. And so based on this research alone, and they identified that survivors who don't speak English have a harder time accessing forensic exams than English speaking survivors, right? Non-English speaking and immigrant communities can face a lack of sensitivity and culturally relevant services. Immigrant communities may lack awareness and exams of other services. And the study also showed that in some communities, shame, stigma, and the lack of acknowledgement of rape and sexual assault create significant challenges for survivors to come forward and report, right? So again, you know, and we'll talk about this a little bit more around how language access or lack thereof also enhances trauma for survivors who are limited English proficient or use different modes of communication, right? So again, some more statistics, and this was the National Domestic Violence Hotline, or NDVH, along with us. You know, they did a national survey on the impact of immigrant and language access to Latina survivors. And so based on this and research, and this was done back in 2013, and I think it's still accurate, what they found is there were no Spanish language access services when the police were called, and we still see those issues. There were no Spanish speaking advocates at the local shelter, or there were a limited number of interpreters available at local organizations. There were no Spanish speaking services for helping with legal issues, including obtaining a protective order. Several respondents noted that although they speak English, they prefer to speak Spanish when discussing legal terms. The abusive partner was able to manipulate police because they were able to speak the language. And there were limited Spanish language resources in print and on the internet. And also, you know, and this is language access is not something we invented. It's been a challenge always, right? It has always been a challenge, right? And as long as we know, it's been going on for such a long time. And so again, you know, and it still happens. We still hear the stories, and I know y'all still hear those stories where you have because of lack of interpreters or lack of language access, often children are being used to interpret, right? On behalf of their parent who has been impacted by the gender-based violence or the sexual assault. Family members are being asked or so on. And we also see this happening in court spaces. I can tell you stories, but you already know the stories. where some jurisdictions are asking advocates to serve the role as the interpreter, and that is not right. And I would dare say that some of our organizations are asking bilingual advocates to be interpreters, to translate materials and interpret. And I'm here to tell you, are you going to pay for that skill? Right? Yes, having bilingual and bicultural staff is an added value, but that's an extra skill. And we also have to understand that the skill of interpretation and translation is a different level of expertise, professional expertise, right? And that's a whole nother conversation. That's a whole different workshop, which we'll be glad to do if you know, when next time this happens. But again, being mindful of that. And then just some more statistics, how COVID or the pandemic has impacted immigrant and limited English survivors as it comes to what's happening right now in the world. And we did a couple of briefs in reaction to COVID and pandemic, Casa, Esperanza, Ujima, API, and so on. And just how COVID has impacted in this way is there have been reports of people arriving at hospitals and language access not being afforded, leading to negative outcomes. They are not able to communicate with doctors about their symptoms. In some cases, immigrants have died, not being able to communicate, and their final wishes before death have not been fulfilled due to lack of language access services. Departments of health and other government agencies have failed to provide, in some cases, information in other languages, leaving individuals to depend on private nonprofit or community activists to generate their own materials in other languages. Many advocates have been doing systems advocacy with agencies that have failed to comply with their own legal obligations. So, very quickly, if you receive any type of federal or state government funding, you are required to provide language access. You are required to have a language access plan. So I'm just letting you know. And if you don't have one, it's okay. You can reach out to us. We can help you develop a language access plan. So again, you can see how lack of language access can lead to severe consequences. And we know this, right? Because we provide life-saving services, right? So I'm going to pause here for a moment. Gordon and Alexis, just wondering if there's any questions or comments in the chat.
We do have a couple of comments in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Someone says rural communities in Central Texas still don't have Spanish-speaking law enforcement officers. Mm-hmm. And someone else says that's just disgusting and sad to hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But we can make a change, y'all. Don't lose hope. I know it kind of sounds dreary, but you know, that's my job right now. But we're gonna get there, I promise you. But there's hope, and there have been other organizations that do this work in other parts of the country that have figured it out. And one of the other tenets that we strongly uplift at Casa Esperanza is peer-to-peer knowledge. You all have the knowledge, right? And so again, if you need some help with this, please feel free to reach out. Okay, now moving on into, you know, the relation between language as identity, right? That's at core, right? Because we all have language or have different modes of communication. So again, what does that mean and how does it feel like, and what is at the core of this relation between language as part of our identity? And so I'm going to read this very quickly because I think it's so important. Conversation and learning rarely happen unless people can talk, communicate to and understand each other. Again, I repeat this. Conversation and learning rarely happen unless people can talk, communicate to and understand each other. And isn't that one of our foundations as advocacy? If survivors are not able to express their fears, their concerns, their losses, isn't that at the core of the work, or one of the principal cores of work that we do. And you do this on a daily basis, right? You do this. Even within the frame of just working with survivors who are English dominant, often we're having to interpret the trauma of the language, or the trauma that's being communicated to our other service providers, right? And we're speaking English, but sometimes other people do not understand what they're communicating, right? And so we do things like active listening, reflection, and even then when we're talking and using the same language, things get lost in that communication, right? So we have to learn those skills of listening. So again, if a survivor is not able to express who they are, share their concerns, their fears, because ultimately they could lose their lives, this is a problem. This is how language is so integral as part of our identity. So how does this connect to language, identity, and privilege, right? And I would dare say some of us who do speak English, we are part of the dominant English-speaking language, and we have English-speaking privilege, right? And then for those of us who are able to, who are bilingual or maybe polylingual, we have different privileges. We are able to speak in perhaps what I call our ancestral language, or the language of our forefathers or our parents or whomever, right? But language, identity, and privilege. So I'm going to ask a couple more questions. So what is the relationship between language and identity? How does your language affect your identity? How does language define a community's identity and power? Oops. So very quickly, this is a moment to pause. So anyone have any thoughts to these particular questions? Like what do you think is the relationship between language and identity? Either feel free to write or unmute yourselves if that's okay. So I see Kayla raised their hands. Kayla?
Yeah, I'm not Spanish speaking, but I know a coworker mentioned the other day, she said that sometimes it can be triggering to translate because she translated always for her family, being like the younger child, always translating, and that sometimes translation can be complicated in that identity through there. And when she said that, as someone who doesn't relate in that way, I found that really eye-opening, that was her relationship with language and that identity, because I never knew that. And I never even thought about how that relationship is. She was always a translator. And so sometimes translation is frustrating for her. And so that was just something that I heard her say that I was like, oh, what an interesting thought process that brought a new light of that translation that I thought was interesting.
Thank you, Kayla. And that's why when we talk about language access, it is an organizational commitment, right? And you bring also a very important point, which I also didn't realize that as well, Kayla. For some survivors, there's one particular person shared that she was Latina, but the reason she never learned Spanish is because her abusive father used Spanish at the time of the violence.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. It's so weird how they become intertwined and you hear the language. Yeah. It's so intertwined with your relationships and your identity that people don't even understand. I had a friend when I was in the Air Force who, if you were, as she said it, as she put it, if you're brown, you better speak Spanish, because if you didn't, to her, then your brown identity was not true. And so if anyone came into the Air Force, into our squadron, and was brown and didn't speak Spanish, then your Mexican or Hispanic identity was negated. And it was so weird to me, but that's how she identified identity. It was just strange, but like that, like you just said, it's like, it's so much more complicated than that. It's not as simple, oh, just because you're brown, you should know Spanish. It's more than that. So yeah, this helps a lot to understand that.
Thank you. Yeah. And of course, it's a lot more complex for sure. And we can do another session around this, but anyone else, Karen or Alexis, anyone else?
Yes, we have Rick who mentioned in the chat, I think as a brown person who doesn't speak Spanish, there's an expectation just by looking at my tan skin. And when I struggle with speaking, there's almost a sense of disappointment, which leads to identifying as not brown enough for my own people. The older generations in my family are bilingual, but it was not taught to us because of the racism they experienced.
Right. And those are some of the root causes of some of us who may have lost our ability to speak another language because of survival, right? And so on. Anything else? Any other thoughts on the rest of the language or rest of the questions?
Yes, we have more comments.
Juan.
Oh,
sorry. Hey, Jose Juan, it's Rick. I just wanted to add to that really quickly that, you know, in my family, what happened was they
Did y'all
lose? We were all taught. Oh,
we are losing you.
Oh, sorry. Can y'all hear me?
We can hear you now.
Okay, sorry. They in my family, they stressed education over dual language. It was more don't talk like a Mexican because people are going to think you're stupid and uneducated, right? Lose the accent, you know, speak proper English education. So in a weird way, you know, any semblance of people looking at you and thinking that you're stupid just because you're brown is going to get, you know, pushed aside because you're educated and you don't speak like, you know, a Mexican. So it's a weird thing. But now, you know, all of the kids in my family are all in, are all in bilingual programs and they're all learning Spanish.
Yeah. So it is a challenge. It is the complexities of, again, the isms connected to be able to speak other languages, especially if you are more ethnic looking and so on and so forth. One more, Karen, any other thoughts before we move on?
Yes, we have two more, one from Veronica. I am from Mexico and considered hard hearing. When I speak English, my accent is strong. People assume it's because I'm not native at English, but I also have a strong accent in Spanish. And then from Madison, yes, I wasn't taught Creole because my grandparents were brutalized for speaking it. I feel completely disconnected from that part of my heritage now.
Right, the historical trauma around our ancestral languages being colonized or being brutalized because we spoke ancestral language, right? So thank you for that. So now we're gonna go into a video. I'm definitely gonna say a warning for this video. You know, take care of yourselves. Yeah, so just wanna give that gentle self-care announcement.
A bunch of kids are like making fun of me, like, why does your mom say your name weird? And I was offended a little bit. I was acting and singing in my first musical play. I noticed that my mom was sitting right in the restricted front row area. She wasn't allowed to do that. But I mean, I love it.
I remember my teacher said that I was doing really bad in history. And it was just very embarrassing too because I had to translate that to my mom.
There was this time that the dryer broke and then my dad likes to fix everything. But he goes to the store and comes home and he tells me I need a thermostat. I'm like, Dad, I don't know. There's no thermostat. And he talks to the guy again. And then I'm like, you wanted a thermostat this whole time. He was like, sometimes you just have to try to understand what I'm saying.
The telemarketer, they'd come. She'd say, hey, come talk to them. And I would stand on the phone. I find out that they're trying to convince me, like a 7 to 8 year old, trying to sell me insurance. And I don't know how to respond to that.
Every afternoon, my mom would walk my brother and I down to the park in our community. This little girl started kicking sand in my direction. My mom, without touching her, she puts her hand over her legs and she just says, stop. She ran off. There were 4 or 5 big women pushing each other out of the way, grabbing each other by the shoulder, saying, let me get a piece of her, let me get a piece of her. My mom just sort of stood there like, why are you talking to me? I don't know what's going on. I sit in front of her, 8-year-old me, and I just did this with my hands to protect my mom. There were all these horrific things that were being said to my mom, and I had to translate all of that. I lost it. Now I was crying, and I, standing behind her, holding onto her shirt. Soon enough, boom, punch straight to the face. Because her priorities were always work, work, work in order to survive, she had no time and energy to dedicate to learning English. When it comes to shame, I feel like not only do they feel it, but I get the first wave of that shame. Having to hear things like, well, why don't your parents speak English? While your dad or your mom are here in the background saying things like, oh, that lady, she didn't treat us very well. She spoke like she was very mean.
Since I was a young child trying to help translate for my parents, people always had this idea that I didn't have the capabilities of understanding what the conversation was about.
And I know that when I was, younger, I'd get so frustrated asking my parents, Mom, can you help me write a sentence? I'm sorry, Mika, I don't know how to do that. Go ask your dad. Okay, Dad, can you help me write a sentence? I'm sorry, Mika, I don't know how to do that. She came home from work and she was like acting very frustrated and I was like, Mom, like what's up? And she was like, sir, you don't understand. And I was like, what do you mean, Mom? And she's like, I'm stupid. And she said, I'm slow. I'm uneducated. And that's how I knew my biggest regret in my entire life is that I didn't teach my mom more English when I was a kid.
My dad was a veteran in the Vietnam War. My parents had to flee the country. So every time I have to translate for them, I think about why do I even have to do that? And it's because they sacrificed so much to be here for me.
Now that I'm older, I feel like they don't even need to learn English. Knowing more than I should know about my parents as a younger kid makes me feel much more capable to take care of them when they're older.
I just want to tell my parents how much I'm grateful for them, regardless of sometimes this forced responsibility of having to be there and translating for them. It's the least I can do to repay them for all their sacrifices.
Mommy, con thương má nhiều lắm. It means I love you, Mom, very much.
Right. So, it's a point of reflection. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute, but just want to see what are folks' thoughts. What did you see, hear, and feel when you saw this video? Susie says, I want to cry too. I'm with you. Heartbreaking, yeah. People are felt their pain, heartbreaking, heartache. Yeah, Felt sadness that the children felt shame and regret for situations out of their control. Felt anger at the system. Yes. It feels like having children translators can be a problem in perpetuating generational trauma. Yes. People got emotional when one of the girls said that looking back, she felt ashamed that she didn't teach her mom more English. Yeah. Ooh, it's a lot, right? It's a lot to take in. But it's also to remind us as advocates the importance of language access and language justice, right? And also to remind us that it is a community problem. It is a community issue. And if we don't stand up and if we don't incorporate it, if we don't incorporate this as part of our advocacy work, as part of our mission statements, this will continue to happen. And if we're honest with each other, we only see a small percentage of survivors that come to our services, that come to our front doors. And how many times in survivors who are limited English proficient or who use modes of different communication are not coming forward to our organization because we don't represent visibly that we are language accessible, right? And that we are trying to connect and appreciate and validate that language is part of our identity and it is part of the holistic approach, trauma-informed approach of our advocacy work, right? Yeah, I wish we all would have been created to speak every language at any given moment, yes. And that is due, and the limited to, and why we don't do that is due to systemic racism, right? And so, yeah, so just being mindful of that. So we will move on, because lots to get through. And again, I offer space for folks, for people, for peers and colleagues. If my contact information will be on there. If you ever want to just talk about this issue, you're more than welcome to do so. Okay. So we're kind of really emphasizing, the relationship between language and cultural identity is language does not exist in isolation. Language is a part of culture, as I've already said. Language and culture are at the core of all human society. Language is a symbolic system through which people communicate and transmit culture, right? Because being able to communicate, let's say in my example of, because I am bilingual in English and Spanish, my family who are in Mexico are able to communicate with me in very specific ways because language is also attached to emotion, right? And the types of words that we use, the adjectives, the adverbs, nouns, verbs, whatever that we use to describe what we're feeling is directly connected to language. And it also is connected in how we share our histories, right? And our stories. Language as part as community's identity and power, maintenance of a minority language within a majority culture, such as Spanish in this case in the US, is often associated with the maintenance of a minority's values and with a continuation of its unique cultural identity. I don't know about you, but I learned a lot about my, maybe not the best way, but one of the ways I stayed connected and learned about my Mexican heritage was through telenovelas or soap operas, right? The Mexican ones in particular. And then also learn a little bit more about other Latin American countries through other novelas or soap operas from those specific countries. And in fact, I read a research on how really people who are immigrants here in the US from the 22 Latin American countries that are in the world often stay connected to their community because of available Spanish language television or programming, and so on. Loss of a language can also be associated with a loss of cultural identity. Languages can be lost for a variety of reasons, right? And one of them, as I mentioned boldly, is systemic racism. colonization, so on. As social conditions change, language may be imposed and another suppressed by a dominant power. And just like the example Rick gave earlier, you know, I grew up that as well, even though I grew up in Brownsville, Texas, where, you know, people predominantly spoke Spanish and so on. In schools, there was, and to some extent there is some oppression around speaking a different language, speaking Spanish, right? And so, but luckily I had family, parents who affirmed that a lot. So the culture in the environment superseded that, thank goodness. Okay, so any other comments or questions, Karen or Alexis at this point?
We don't have any questions on the chat. I did make a comment that I also grew up with telenovelas.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just typing how I was not allowed to speak Spanish at my school. And I even remember teachers giving punishment to students who did. So I wanted to make that comment.
Yeah, and we still do in a certain way, in a very institutional way, where we put limited English proficient students or children into ESL classes and put them into special ed because they don't speak English, when in fact they're intelligent, they can do the math, except there's no language access, right? So we still see that happening, except it's now more institutionalized in a way that is very subtle and very mainstreamed. So, which, speaking of institutionalized oppression, the intersections of language and trauma, as I mentioned before, you know, and as Kayla also mentioned, right, for some of us, there is trauma associated with language access or around our ability to speak different languages. So question is, have you ever tried to learn, or anyone has ever tried to learn a different language? And again, please put your responses in the chat or unmute yourselves. Have you ever experienced a moment where language access was not available to you? And is the language you speak tied to your identity, right? Margaret Bean, you've raised your hand. Go ahead, Margaret.
So I just, I was thinking about what we were talking about earlier, and then with these questions. So I come from a mixed family, right? So my mom's side is Irish, German, and Spaniard. And then my dad's side were Mexican. So it was this contrast for me growing up. I had a great grandmother and my madrina that were trying to teach me Spanish. But because of the systemic racism that my grandparents on my dad's side had learned, they would get mad at them for trying to teach me Spanish. And so I lost it. I lost it at a very young age. And then once I started to grow up, my mom's side of the family was like, no, we need to learn Spanish. That's not okay. So here my family member is attempting to learn Spanish on my mom's side. And let me tell you, I love them to death, but it's like they have a super hard time. And so as I grew up, I was very dark and I was very tan, and I looked like my dad's side of the family. But now that I'm older, I'm white passing. And so it's very hard for me because I'm starting to relearn Spanish, and I've learned a good amount of it. I can now conduct therapy in it, except it's what I would consider like broken Spanish, right? Because there are still times that I trip myself up because I get so anxious that the people, my Spanish speaking clients, are going to look at me like, your maiden name's Rodriguez, you should be able to speak Spanish. Why aren't you speaking Spanish, right? And then it's like, I have the other side where they're like, oh, you speak Spanish, you look white. And it's hard, you know? And to this day, you know, my dad has this regret. He's like, I should have taught you more Spanish. He's like, I should have stood up to my parents. And I'm like, yes, but in our culture, you don't stand up to your elders. You don't stand up to your parents. And I said, so it's okay, Dad. It's okay. I'm learning it now. And now he'll practice with me. and my mom still tries to speak Spanish. And it's just such a change now that I'm working in this field, and I have Spanish speaking clients, and I've had some where I explained to them the very first session, like, I can speak Spanish, I can understand you fully, I can read it fully. I said, but when I speak it, sometimes I'll mess up. So feel free to correct me so I can learn from you. And I've had it on both sides. Majority of the time they appreciate it and they're like, oh, okay, no, that's fine. But then I've had other ones that are like, no, I don't want to. I don't want to. And so it makes me nervous, but it is tied to my identity because I lost that Spanish at a young age. And then I was told I'm not brown enough to be Mexican and I'm not white enough to be white, like Irish, that, even now, sometimes I have a conflict of trying to figure out my identity because I want to identify with both sides of my family. But one side of the family was very open and sharing their culture with me, which was my mom's side, and was open to embracing the Mexican culture of my father. But my father's side was not comfortable sharing that with me. So at a later age, I'm having to learn it. And it's just, all of this has been just eye-opening. I've tried to, I had to go to a different country, and they told us while we were there, try to speak Spanish because they'll understand that more than they'll understand English. Because I went to Italy and they were just like, they'll appreciate you trying to speak a different language other than just straight English to them, and so it was definitely interesting. Sorry, I just had to share.
No, thank you, Margaret. And I think your what you shared kind of exemplifies, it answers all these 3 questions, right? And there is trauma attached to that. Loss of identity, things that I've already mentioned. So Karen or Alexis, anyone else?
Yes, so we have many comments on the chat. Many who have said that they have tried to learn a different language, whether it was because for their careers where they're located. One person is located in San Antonio. A person said they did it for fun. They tried to learn ASL. Tammy reported saying for personal relationship reasons, because the person they're married to is Hispanic and they're trying to learn that language. And then Marilyn commented how they're trying to get connected to their culture.
Yeah. And yes. So we're running out of time. So moving forward, I'm going to show another video. Again, a message on care. This video. Just take care of yourselves.
Doctor on that video. That's Tandoro. Good.
Excuse me, sir. I'm so sorry.
Attending being done.
Look, she's been crying nonstop. She has a temperature of 105. I don't know what to do.
Marabidig. Bipolarus lasant.
No, please, just every time I feed her, she throws up. I don't know.
Bipolarus lasant.
What are you saying? Can you just look at her? No, she's burning up. Just feel.
Bipolarus la anglan.
What?
She's
She's burning up. Feel her head.
Tranquilly. The Monday is Askan.
What is he doing?
Do you have?
My baby, she's got a temperature of 105. Every time I feed her, she throws up. Please, can you? She's burning up. Feel her head. Please, just feel her head. Feel her head. Just someone let me in to see the doctor. No, does anyone understand what I'm saying? Please, someone help me.
8% of U.S. citizens.
So Gamma, stop sharing. Same questions, moment of reflection. What do people see, feel, and think? Oh gosh, I'm sorry, Audrey. I don't mean to make people cry. But it's good reflection. Sad and scary, yes. Sadness. Yeah. And the reason I use this video, or we use this video, is because often when we talk about language access, we often, I think, the immediate reaction is we put people of color in the space of vulnerability and never the mainstream identity, right? And you can see that, you know, for those of you who may have traveled outside the US, maybe have experienced lack of language access, this is what happens with survivors, right? Or survivors that use different modes of communication. That's why I'll say this again, that's why it has to be an organizational shift in paradigm when creating systems that connect to people's language as part of their identity, and how lack of providing language access creates further trauma, or how we as organizations are unintentionally creating that trauma. Yeah, Victoria says, panic and overwhelming. What would I do in that situation? Exactly. And here you have survivors who come to us, even when they're English speaking. Sometimes it's very difficult to communicate, right? Because of the trauma they're going through, and there's so much stuff happening, coming up at the same time, right? And how do we figure that out together, right? And then just add the extra layer of maybe someone who uses a different mode of communication or what have you, right? So again, grounding ourselves in as much as we can in that space of our advocacy work, and really, really trying to make that change as organizations. But then also, once we have that accountability within our organizations, having those conversations with our external peers and other service organizations, whether they're systems-based or whatever. And that's a whole nother challenge, right? Because your organization may be at this level of analysis, but perhaps this other organization may not. And we continue to see those things happening, right? So I'm going to go back to the screen. Right. And so just to put some research to it, or some context to it, is there are multiple barriers to learning English, and that many individuals experience, including having multiple jobs, lack of time, lack of childcare. So again, when people have come to this and I think we all do this at some point in our lives. Well, why don't you just speak English or what have you? It's like, because there's so many barriers to that, right? Learners, and as some of you shared, right? Some of you have tried to learn other languages, and maybe with some success, maybe with some limited success. And even when you have, you may speak it with some hesitance because you're ashamed that you're speaking it with an accent, right? Or not clearly pronunciating the language. Survivors who have undergone traumatic experiences may experience symptoms such as anxiety, poor concentration, and memory problems, which have direct connections to learning difficulties. There's always anxiety involved in speaking or writing in a second language. So keep that in mind when you are translating intake forms or what have you. In addition to second language anxiety, survivors of crime are experiencing much higher levels of trauma and stress. Experiencing language barriers while trying to access services adds to the stress and anxiety and re-victimizes the individual, right? So again, for those of you who are in the process of, translating your websites and so on, making sure that the language is in plain language, making sure that people are able to access it in easy ways, and so on. But again, reminding ourselves how trauma and language and the ability to communicate are so interconnected. And so I mentioned this before. I mean, a lot of us who are English speaking are part of the, we have privilege because we speak English, right? And so when we have that privilege of language and speaking the dominant language, it's easier to access social, political, and educational institutions, right? it's we have greater access to an additional form of capital, right? And that can come in so many different ways. And then we also have the ability to avoid having one's speech perceived negatively, right? And that also means like if we don't speak with an accent, and then, like the example I gave earlier, for those of us who do speak with a certain twang to our a southern twang to our English, again, there's assumptions about our intelligence. There's an assumption or what have you, or even for those of us who English is our second language, I think I have an accent. I know I've been told so. And so again, when you have language privilege, it's so much easier to access things. It's so much easier to explain yourself, and being and not being taken for granted, but actually believed. And so in my own learning, I kind of had to learn, like, what does it mean? How is the language privilege breaking down into the isms? So we talk about linguistic imperialism. We talk about accent bias. We talk about linguistic racism, right? And very briefly, linguistic imperialism is basically the English language. You know, globally, the English language has filtered into different parts of the world. You know, if you go to a certain country for a vacation, you bet your $100 that there will be pockets of English speaking spaces for you, right? Or for us who are English speakers. Accent bias, as I mentioned before, some of us do have, when we hear a certain accent, we may have a bias. And for those of you who don't know, you know, research has shown that certain accents are found more attractive than others, you know, and guess which those accents are, right? And mostly those Anglo-European accents are found more attractive. And certainly, I don't know about you, but people who have a British accent are often thought of as more intelligent, right? And so on. And then linguistic racism, and it's basically connected to these other two, but where, you know, if we shared some of those examples, where you completely lose your ability to speak another language because, you know, you don't want to be othered, you don't want to further experience some type of lack of access because, you know, you're brown and you speak with an accent or you speak another language, right? And I think Rick gave a good example of that, where, and he's often shared this, where, like, you know, he comes up and his name, like Rick Gibbridge, and sorry to use you as an example, Rick, but, you know, if you shared this in public, like, your name does not match how you identify physically, right? And so kind of burying those, you know, bridging those things, right? And I know, you know, and for those of us who have Spanish surnames or ethnic sounding names, you know, and there's research around hiring practices that if you have an ethnic sounding name on your job application, you more than likely are going to be passed over for that job. And there's research to attest to that, right? And so looking at those things, right? And then just looking at how much of our referrals or how we connect survivors to other systems is based on paper, right? And how much of that, when people see other service agencies or providers see a person's name and they can't pronounce it, what some of these English only isms are going to come forward for them, right? So language access, right? So part of cultural identity or connecting language as part of our cultural identity is also and I've mentioned the word language access, and what does that mean? And so language access basically means is the systemic planning or creating of language access in your organizations or systems, right? It is both a legal and ethical mandate to ensure that all survivors receive equal access to justice, regardless of the language or mode of communication that they use or prefer to use. And then the cost of not providing language access is too high, and ultimately people losing their children, custody of their children, their homes, and ultimately maybe losing their lives because we fail to provide language access and to achieve justice in whatever issue that may happen or circumstance it may be. And so again, language access requires some planning, requires protocol writing, and so on. So language access, basically, that's what that is. And as I mentioned before, if you receive any type of federal or state government funding, you are mandated to create language access plannings and services, language accessible services. If you receive VOCA-VAWA money, for example, HHS money, you are mandated to create language access. Language justice. And I think it was yesterday's coffee with Rose, or it was the day before, where Denise from Casa talked very briefly around language justice. And to me, language justice moves us beyond just language access, right? Because you can create a language access plan and so on and so forth, but it makes no sense if we don't have the analysis as to why we have to have language access and the importance of. And language justice takes us into spaces where we actually challenge and hold ourselves accountable in our various systems of help that, oh no, you will provide language access. But beyond that, like, it has to be just, you have to create a space of justice, right? And so what is language justice? It's basically the right of anyone to communicate in the language or mode in which they feel most comfortable, right? Period. That's it. And we do this just many different ways. We do this by creating multilingual spaces like Casa has created here for the virtual institute or conference. Ungendering language, which is sometimes, well, not sometimes, it is a difficult thing to do. And decentering monolingual only practices, right? So what does that mean? So when we create multilingual spaces, it is a collective agreement by everyone in the group, you know, facilitators, whatever, or organizations or what have you, to fully bring both or multiple languages and cultures to the discussion table, right? No one is left out of it. We try to create within possibility as much access to those spaces. It's a shared analysis of the way language and culture can both empower and oppress, to include and exclude. It's a co-facilitation of bilingual, bicultural facilitation who can lead the process in both languages and can draw out and reflect the group's different cultural reference points. And then also comprehensive written translation that meets reasonable standards of meaningful access in whatever language that may be, right? Or mode of communication. We're running out of time here. I guess we only have 5 minutes. Ungendering language. Again, biggest example is using the person's gender pronoun that they identify with. Ungendering, and then it can also be kind of complex when you deal with other languages than English. For example, Spanish is a very gendered language. And within the complexity of that conversation, there's different points of view around that. But all that to say, that also happens in the English language as well. You know, and LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer people are defining in ways that are true to who they are. That means reclaiming and challenging language in the process, and so on. And then decentering monolingual only practices, it basically means that language justice work is long-term. Always keep bringing it up. You know, if you have meetings or trainings, asking the question, are we going to provide language access, right? And it should be part of your process. If you are bilingual and interested in learning more about interpretation, you know, make an effort to learn about what that is, right? And what it requires to be an interpreter. As I mentioned before, that's a whole different level, higher level of expertise that is required to be an interpreter. And if you happen to be the assigned bilingual advocate in your organization, I would definitely encourage you to learn more about the difference between interpretation and translation and what all that involves. And then if you're already doing interpretation and want to think more about language justice, commit to learning more about what it takes to create multilingual spaces, right? Again, you can reach out to us at Casa Esperanza National Latino Network. You can reach out to Denise out of Casa. And there's several people out there that can help you try to get to those spaces. And, quite honestly, we're also every day, we're all at Casa Esperanza National Latino Network, we're often challenging ourselves and reminding ourselves of these practices around language justice. And then culture responsive through language justice, it promotes autonomy, self-determination, creates linguistically democratic spaces where no one language is privileged, and it teaches that interpretation is not in the service of the non-English speakers, but rather for everyone that does not share a common language or different modes of communication, right? And so, again, just very quickly, in the last 3 minutes that I have, goes back to understanding cultural identity and our work. Is like, who are you in the work as an advocate? And I don't care if you're identified as an advocate or preventioneer, it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, who are you in this work around creating both culturally and linguistically accessible spaces for survivors from diverse communities, right? Who is the person in front of you who you're trying to advocate with, not for, but with, because it's a partnership. For means you are usurping the person's voice, in my opinion. How do you see the person and how do they see you? Because often when we go to these trainings, it's about how we perceive the community we're trying to engage, and never the other way around. We never put ourselves on the critical side of that lens. What is the context of your work and the principles that guide it? A lot of us who do this work identify as survivors or maybe have been impacted directly or indirectly, but it has to be much more than that. Like, what are the principles that guide your work and also your lives? Because as I say to people, this is working towards a framework of equity and justice in whatever levels that they are, is not just a professional aspect, but it's a personal work, especially for those of us who are at the intersections of those communities that are most marginalized. And how do all these things come together for you, right? And you as a representative of your organization or agency, and you as a member of your community or communities, and you as an individual person trying just to live your life without any further violence or hassle because you speak a different language or speak with an accent or you use a different mode of communication. And so just to put it in perspective, at the center of this is the survivor, right? And often we sometimes get these blinder or these tunnel visions where we forget that our case intake, caseload, case plan, service plan is not the only one this person is being impacted by. And so now, and we already do this because part of your advocacy is advocating with some of these systems that I've listed here around not just that system understanding the dynamics of domestic violence, but also understanding how culturally specifically it impacts this person or that community or that person within that community or communities. So that's it. I think we are at time, and I don't think there's time for questions. But again, I'm going to stop sharing. And I don't know if we have time for questions or comments, but yes.
Thank you so much, Jose Juan. I believe we have a little bit of time if anyone wants to ask anything. Perfect timing. And there's nothing after this, so we can stay on a couple of minutes if folks would like to do that.
Yeah. And again, just want to affirm that, our approach to this work is strength-based as well, culture responsive and so on. So if I come off like, do this, it's because I have to have an expectation of high level of practice because of the work that we do is life-saving, right? But having said that, we also work within the frame or the the frame of the organization and where they're at in that conversation, right? But we will have honest conversations, y'all. So, but in a caring way.
We have people in the chat asking if they could see your contact information on the last slide.
Yes. There you go. Can you all see the slide? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. And you'll also receive a copy of the PowerPoint slides, I believe, so my contact information will be there as well. So, yeah. And those are our various social medias that please follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I don't think we have a Snapchat because no, I don't know what else is out there, but definitely Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Yeah, any other questions?
Someone in the chat said this was such a great presentation, such important information.
Thank you. Yeah. And like I said, we're always open to have meaningful relationships with the folks that are doing this, where people are doing this work out there, because it's so important that what you all are doing. You're not by yourself or alone in the work, so please know that. Yeah. And again, as a resource center, we do these type of trainings for all forms of organizations. So if you're interested in doing this, like for your staff, or if you're interested in or thinking about developing a language access plan, you're certainly welcome to reach out to us. You know, that's one of our core tenets or areas of technical assistance. And we have other areas as well of training and technical assistance we provide. So definitely welcome to reach out to us or to me. If there are no other questions, I'll just say this. If you haven't heard it lately, you're gonna hear from me, because y'all are amazing, y'all are amazing, y'all are amazing, y'all are amazing. The work that you do is not easy. The work that you do, well, the work that you've been called to do is not easy, because this is a calling and not just anyone can do that. You're not just the advocate, or you're just not the volunteer coordinator or the prevention coordinator. You are a human being, you're a person, you're part of community, you are part of family. So please know that I see you. I don't know you, but I see you, I validate you, and please know that you are amazing. And whoever tells you otherwise, well, whatever. But understand that. And so please always know that you have an ally and an advocate in me. I don't have all the answers, but definitely together we can bridge the gap. So thank you, everybody, and thank you for your participation. Again, thank you to Casa, thank you to Karen, Alexis, our amazing interpreters. So I would definitely encourage you to learn more about what interpretation is and what interpreters do and translators do, to have more empathy and more connection to that, because it is a whole different level of work. Yeah.
Muchas gracias, Gabriela y Tania, por ser nuestras intérpretes hoy. En el chat hay un enlace para tomar una encuesta. Por favor, tome unos minutitos para completarla. Es la última antes de la encuesta general. Gracias.
Thanks so much again, Jose Juan. This was such an eye-opening presentation. I know I learned a lot from your knowledge and your expertise, and we look forward to continuing these conversations with you. But if nobody has any other questions, I think I'm going to go ahead and end this Zoom meeting. And we look forward to seeing y'all next year. We look forward to hearing from you. Make sure you fill out those evaluations. And we'll see you next time, everyone.
Bye, y'all. Take care.
Bye.